Hello, my name is Mina Fletcher, and I will be talking about my final project for computer graphics fall 2022. So looking at the animation that I have currently on the screen, this at the moment is what I was able to produce for my initial idea of creating a disco ball animation. So the original intention was to create a spinning disco ball that had a reflective material, so a specular that meant that it was reflecting the light around it to create that disco ball effect, and then also being able to reflect light onto a surface behind it, just like a disco ball does. I am aware that that is not what we are currently seeing on the screen at this moment, and there definitely has been a very long learning process and lots of obstacles along the way. So I'm grateful for this presentation to be able to talk about what I learned and the time that I spent looking into different areas to get through this assignment. So one of the first things that I had some main learning obstacles with was being able to just initially create objects and materials in Blender. So Blender is a new platform to me, and while the platform itself is very easy to use, it's very easy to create a shape. I was struggling a lot with creating materials and understanding how to then export these materials and textures into a different program. So initially, when I made my first disco ball, I followed some online tutorials for creating YouTube animations. So following this example YouTube video for creating a disco ball that had a bit of an actual texture to it rather than just a smooth sphere. And then being able to create the same materials in Blender. And the goal was to export these exact materials that I made into my object loader. So looking what I was able to produce, this was a pretty difficult process dealing with textures, and I struggled a lot with this idea of texture mapping. And so because I wanted to export materials that I made within Blender, I had to watch a lot of different YouTube videos, probably hours worth of time spent trying to just understand texture mapping and how to do the process successfully. In the end, I was unsuccessful, and so from struggles with importing objects from Blender into my code base, even just because of small things like not clicking the triangulated mesh, which Mike and I resolved during our office hours today. That, in addition to not being able to do texture mapping successfully, I decided then to look instead onto online resources, and so online existing textures. So we can see an example here of an online resource I found of a disco ball on a smooth sphere. And so this texture was able to provide a few different maps, for example, a diffuse map, a normal map that I intended to use, and then put over a simple sphere in my code base. And so what we can see animating here is an example of a sphere that I was able to load into the object loader and then map the diffuse and normal values onto it properly. And it is a little bit distorted, but I think that's okay. And I think it still gives the same effect of a disco ball. So from this point, I was able to at least see that I could have the texture working. So, and being able to get my object loader working was a great part of this assignment as well. I really focused on that in assignment 5 because I knew that I wanted to have a successfully working object loader for this assignment. And then I also constantly referenced our Lab 9 as Lab 9 was a really great example of working with like multiple lights. So I looked at Lab 9 and Line 8, and I basically kind of tried to take the code from Lab 9 and integrating it with my object loader so that I had a working object loader that also was able to properly incorporate multiple lights into the shader. And so from there, because I was working with lights, I really wanted to be able to create a kind of glimmering light effect on the brick wall that I have behind this shape. It was also fun working with kind of multiple objects, which was an interesting thing that I hadn't done before. And so I wanted to be able to create a reflective effect on the wall. And so I wanted to use spotlights in order to display multiple spotlights onto the wall and animate them so that it appeared as though it was light reflecting off of the ball onto the wall. So in my code, we can see an example of me attempting to integrate my spotlights. So again, I referenced Lab 9, and I took some of the code from there and I integrated it in and worked specifically with point lights and spotlights. I unfortunately was unsuccessful with my spotlights, and I was not able to figure out why, because I felt like I had transferred everything over as much as I needed to from Lab 9 to this one. And so because I was unsuccessful with the spotlights, I decided to just stopped focusing my time on that because I had spent a lot of time up until this point, probably 10 hours or so up until this point, of things that were not really getting me anywhere and kind of just wasting time. So I decided and then to move from focusing on the spotlights towards working on creating a specular map for my disco ball. So the goal here was to create a specular map, so integrate a specular map to be imported into the fragment shader and then processed to display a mirror-like effect on the disco ball. So as we can see, I do not currently have that effect because I was not able to get it working, functioning properly. But I would like to talk about the process that I went through and what I was able to understand about specular maps, because I think that's the most significant part of this assignment that I was able to gain. So within my code, we can see some examples of where I was able to create a specular map alongside my diffuse and normal maps, and then set that specific map to my shader properly, as well as bind it to the same location. So having the diffuse texture at my first location in the bind, and then my specular map at the second location. And so from here, looking at my fragment shader, I was able to bring the specular map in the same way that I did with the diffuse map, and then create the texture accordingly, and following a similar method towards using the diffuse map, looking at creating a value for the specular that uses the specular strength that's given from the point light, as well as the defined value for spec, and then using the spec color map in my fragment color to add the actual specular texture in addition with the spec values to be able to apply the spec to the entire object and have it look correctly. So this is just a brief overview of where I attempted to implement this properly. And again, for whatever reason, I was unsuccessful. And I found some interesting specific things that maybe were kind of a hint of where something was going wrong. So for an example, in the one that we have right here, we can just see that like the brick wall behind is visible and doesn't seem to have the same effect that I'm thinking of. But sometimes when I run the code, I'll get some errors that say, as we can see in my terminal, that the texture is unloadable. So this is a clear sign that something is going wrong, but I was not able to figure out exactly what it was that was causing this. Another interesting observation is that there was sometimes I would be able to get the spec without it actually giving me that error. And it's a little difficult to see in this picture. But what I was noticing was that occasionally I could see that the actual, I think it was maybe the normal map from, maybe it was a specular map, but I think the normal map from my disco ball was actually being reflected onto the brick wall behind it. So I could see that there were some lines in addition to the brick wall that was actually the same pattern that was on the disco ball. And so it's very possible that the way that I was kind of assigning specific textures per object, maybe they were getting mixed up with each other, and they weren't specifically being kept within the single object that they're in. Again, I was not able to figure it out in the end based on the time restrictions that I had. But one thing that I do want to mention about working with the specular map is that it was a really great way of reintroducing myself and re-understanding how the shader is taking in the diffuse map as well as the normal maps. So because I was referencing a specific tutorial that Mike gave me in office hours actually earlier today, which was working with lighting maps. So looking at the way that we incorporate the diffuse map as well as the specular map, and then also using our own code. So using lab 9 as a reference of how we're giving the diffuse map to the fragment shader, and then specifically how it is actually interpreting that information and then what it's deciding to do with it. So I use both of those as reference to understand the process of how the specular map should work. So even though I was not able to get it to show successfully within the actual animation, I do feel confident that I have a much better understanding of how specular maps actually work. And for that, I am very grateful. And I think in the future, I will definitely know to spend more time or to spend less time on like kind of dead ends that are just like wasting my time. And if something isn't really working, trying to jump to another solution, or to explore other options so that I'm not kind of sticking myself just to going down a rabbit hole where it's not going to get me anywhere. I think over the past few days, I spent a lot of time, more than I should have, researching texture mappings and creating objects, and trying to actually get my disco ball to appear correctly, that I did not give myself enough time to look into working with lights and working with the specular map. So I think in the future, if I were to be able to expand on this project, I would look into creating those spotlights so that I can create a reflective effect on the wall behind it, and working with multiple lights and animating those lights so that they're moving around at the same speed and the same rotation as the disco ball. I would also love to add an interactive aspect to this, so potentially the option for a user to click on different keys, and that can either potentially change the color of maybe one of the lights or change the color of all of the lights, and just add some aspect of being able to read user input and then give those specific values to the shaders. I think it would be really fun to have more experimentation with shaders and how they can be affected by user input and also just different factors. So overall, it's unfortunate that I was not able to produce the visual that I was looking for, but I do feel confident that I spent my time, maybe not effectively, but I spent my time for this assignment. And I am very happy about just the learning that I gained from all of my different obstacles, and especially being able to better understand specular maps. So thank you for listening, and thank you so much for the semester in general. And yeah.